All right, Kirsten, we're going to take a look at your emotive squares posting. Just kind of walk through a few of them, give you some feedback on what we're looking at here. Let's share screen. All right, so actually you got your name on there. You got underscore emotive squares. You are identifying the prompts, the topics here fairly effectively, organizing everything through. The shag carpet's an interesting choice there to use as the background. You know, I don't know if it's distracting. I don't think it is. I mean, I think it's fine. You know, it does make a difference sometimes, the sort of background that you're using. So in just overall scrolling through, I would suggest that the most effective of these layouts, the most effective of these designs, are going to be the ones where you are engaging the entire picture plane. This project is basically set up in two parts. We've discussed already. The one is the organization of the squares themselves. And then the other part is the photography, which is a reductive exercise where you're isolating certain components of this arrangement of the square. So the original arrangements of the squares is part one. That's just to give the sort of the positive and the material for you to then find compositions within that. The photography part is to offer your perspective on those designs. And as you look through, maybe look through some of the other students' work, you'll see how they're approaching it, and that's always a good thing. One of the great things about working with this blog is just that, is you can kind of go through and see how others are doing it, and both in the positive and in where you're thinking, I'm glad I didn't do it that way. That said, the ones that I am noticing that are most effective, just in terms of overall design, let's disregard right now the connection to the topics, which I think you're doing fairly well. I mean, this is a pretty straightforward exercise, and the topics that we were working with are not all that complex to work with. However, when it comes to the overall designs that we're looking at, I think when you're engaging the entire picture plane, like for instance in something like this, even though there are areas that I would suggest could be changed, at the very least what we're doing is we're designing the entire space. I can see that you're thinking about the space here, or at least it's being addressed, and in here, because what's happening is you're allowing parts of the composition to engage this picture plane. You're not resting a square on that edge, you're allowing it to run completely off of the frame that way, which lends itself to engaging the picture plane, which is different than this. Right here, what we have are a bunch of objects floating in space, floating amongst a lot of area, and this space, all this stuff up here, all this stuff here, really isn't participating at all in the composition. It's not doing anything at all. It's sort of like if I had a big old orchestra and I had like 3 instruments in the middle of all that orchestra that were only playing, and none of the others were participating at all. Well, it doesn't make much sense to have all that other there. What we would do is make the stage smaller and isolate those instruments so that they became the focus. And so that's what I'm talking about when we get to the engaging the entire picture plane. I think that is where, when you're doing it, your designs are effective. Even something as simple as this, by coming in my mouse is going crazy there, by coming in and engaging the frame on the edges, so this activates the space so that this becomes more tense. Big difference between that and this, where it's almost the same space, but because we are not engaging, you're creating what's called passive negative space all the way around it. It's less effective. Here, what's happening is we've got a good sort of balance there, although your energy is sort of coming out of a corner, which we kind of want to avoid. The corners of a blank composition, if we had no material in the composition at all, and the material was just that, the corners of that composition are going to be the most interesting. That's why when we start a composition, especially folks that are just learning this language and learning how to arrange within this space, tend to identify and sort of work some of the corners of the composition. The reason for that is when you're looking at it and you're confronted with this empty space and you're like, I got to activate it, the most interesting part of it that you're in just subconsciously sometimes and drawn to is going to be the corner, because that is where the emphasis is, energy is there. The straight lines and the middle is empty, and so you're like, there's nothing there for me to work with. That's why you tend to be drawn to the corner. But that's exactly why you wouldn't want to engage the corners right off, especially if you're working with like minimal design, not a lot of elements. The corners are already active, so we don't have to address them by putting positive objects there. What we want to do is draw the eye from the corners into the middle of the composition and move around. So when we have energy that pulls us to the corner, it's sort of like emphasizing something that's already being emphasized. We really don't need to. The other thing is right up in here, as you can see in the composition, you've got this tiny little energy space right here, which is causing tension, which isn't probably where you want us to be looking and getting stuck. Now this you might have not even seen that in your original photograph. You might have cut it off the way you've got it running off here. But this little bit of space here is not desirable. You want to either have a little more space there so that there's more energy, less energy, so your eye can kind of navigate around that space, or have it running off enough so that you're not drawn away from the composition, sort of like what this is doing. You've got enough of it running off the edge so that the eye isn't pulled away from it at all. All of this is about language, right? All of this is about understanding how to use the construct to communicate things and lead your viewer's eye around the page effectively. So in general, I would say that you're doing a pretty good job in terms of organizing these shapes in context with one another. It's a very simple exercise on that level. But when we have things that are just sort of floating in space like this, I don't think you're actually taking advantage of everything that those shapes have to offer. Instead, something like this, which may seem just really, really simple, what it does is it makes this entire frame active, and that's what you really want to be looking for in these kinds of designs. So down here, I was looking at the feedback, and I don't see where you have replied. And this is where you would reply. You'd hit reply right here and give feedback back, or at least acknowledge or kind of refer to what they're saying. And the reason I'm having everybody do that is when we get feedback, when people are offering us like their perspective on what we've done, the job of the person receiving the feedback isn't to compare, isn't to identify the gap between the intention and the received information. So as I'm giving you the feedback, you may be thinking one thing like, he's not really seeing this, I really wanted him to see that. Or you may be thinking, yeah, he's telling me exactly what I already know or exactly what I want to hear. If you're thinking about it in that way, what you're doing is you're creating a comparative. You're saying, what's the difference between what I want to communicate and what someone is seeing? Instead, consider just looking at what that other person is seeing. Not the difference between you and them, but what they are seeing and how they're arriving at it. That's the most productive and healthy way to deal with critique and deal with feedback, is when someone's offering you the information, rather than doing that comparative, think just how did they arrive at it? That's it. Just think, how are they seeing that? Even if they're telling you exactly what you want to hear, you still want to, in a way, analyze that and go, how are they getting to that? Because if they're telling you what you want to hear, yet they arrived at it in a completely different way than you expected, you want to learn from that. You want to know, how did that happen? The reason for that is, of course, obvious. You want to be able to repeat. what you're doing. If you find successes, you want to be able to know what you did and do it again. And if things aren't working, you want to know how they went that way. What did I present to get someone to see and to think something that wasn't my intention? So that's what you do with the feedback. That's why I asked everyone to do at least one reply to a bit of feedback that someone has offered you. So that's what I wanted to kind of go over with you, kind of talk a little bit about what you produced. I'm glad that you took the initiative to create the pieces. Definitely unique. I don't think anybody else so far that I've seen has done the carpeting as a background. I think it's fine to work. Maybe if it was black squares, I think maybe that would have just visually would have looked better. But that said, you'll get a letter grade. You'll get a handout with the actual rubric grade and stuff like that. But this should serve as a little bit of feedback, video feedback of what you're doing. All right, well, I will see you later on in class, and we'll be looking at the next projects and so on. So, bye-bye now.